All right. Welcome, everyone, to today's seminar of Great Problems, Great Minds that we provide here in the Department of Social Sciences at Illinois Tech. It's the first seminar of the, just a reminder, please mute yourself if you're not talking. I can hear you clickety-clacking, Daniel.
That's my apologies.
No problem. Please, everyone, mute yourself if you're not talking or asking a question. The format for the seminar is for us to have a guest speaker talk about an issue that is of his or her expertise, and then we will open it up for question and answers. So feel free to prepare your question and answers in a couple of different ways. You can take note and write them down, and then when we open it up, you can actually unmute and share your question, or you can write it in the chat, and then we'll hopefully be able to come across it later if there isn't a lot of clutter there. Sometimes it's a little difficult to track everything. So that's the administrative stuff. My name is Matt Shapiro. I'm a professor in the Department of Social Sciences, and it's my great honor to welcome all of you, but especially Toby Bolsen, who is a professor of political science at Georgia State University. Toby is a professor. I think in our announcement we wrote associate professor, but you are a professor now, right, Toby?
That's right. Can you all see me? I can't see anyone. I'm just sort of looking at my PowerPoint. I normally see like.
Yeah, we see you.
Okay, you can see me. Okay.
Looking good.
Okay, great.
Let me go through the rest of the introduction. His research focuses on the study of political communication, preference formation, political behavior, and U.S. energy and climate policy. And some of this, I'm proud to say, we've done together in a number of publications. Dr. Bolsen holds a BA in social science from Eastern Illinois University. He's relatively local. He's got an MA in political science from Southern Illinois, and then a PhD in political science from Northwestern. And Professor Bolsen has received an Outstanding Faculty Achievement Award from Georgia State and was also a Kavli Fellow at the Kavli Frontiers of Science Symposium in Ambon, Indonesia. Long way to go. I remember when you took that trip. Professor Bolsen currently serves on the editorial board of Science Communication, which is a great journal, and is an associate principal investigator for Times Sharing Experiments in the Social Sciences, also known as tests. You can Google any of those things and get more information, or you can look Toby's work up on his website. But for now, we're going to turn it over to Toby, who will give us a presentation, as stated, how conspiracy theories, misinformation, and politics can limit the impact of science. Please take it away, Toby.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I can't see any of you, so you can see me and hear me, and interject, please, if there's any problems with the connection while I'm speaking. So, I just want to thank you very much for inviting me to speak as part of the Great Problems series. Again, I'm Toby Bolsen. I'm a professor in political science at Georgia State. My research broadly is about how people form preferences and how they make decisions in dynamic and polarized information environments. And a lot of it in recent years, and some of what I'll talk about today, has really focused on the impact of different kinds of scientific messages in different environments or contexts. And so I'm going to be not presenting a particular piece of research today, but talking more broadly, conceptually, about how conspiracy theories, misinformation, and politics can limit the impact of science and what we can do about it. And so I hope to keep this presentation to about 30 minutes, and I'll try to keep an eye on that. I've got about 30 slides. And then look forward to your Q&A after that. And so just to give a roadmap for what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to begin by just kind of defining what we mean by some of these concepts of misinformation, politicization, misperceptions. And then after that, talk about some examples of research that I have been involved with that has addressed these questions and looking at issues like climate change, COVID-19 origin conspiracy theories, and even vaccine hesitancy over the last year or two. And then finally, kind of concluding in the third part with, what do we know about what we can do about the challenges that this misinformation, politicization of science, and conspiracy theories present to societies and humans in public policy. And so, in the World Health Organization in 2019 declared two of the top 10 public health threats being climate change and vaccine hesitancy. Yet we have seen heated political disagreements, just most recently with COVID, of course, in terms of the necessity of lockdowns, the usefulness of distance wearing, social distancing, of wearing masks, getting vaccinated. And, we know that science can play an important role in many, these issues and many others in sort of informing citizens and policymakers. But, we also know that large portions of the public hold misperceptions about many scientific issues, and whether that's misperceptions about climate change, the safety of genetically modified organisms, or links between vaccines and safety, and other issues. So just to step back for a second, when we talk about misinformation, I'm defining that as a communication that's false, misleading. It's based on unsubstantiated information. These misinformations can come in many guises: rumors, fake news, conspiracy theories. And these have distorted people's views about some of the most consequential issues in politics, science, and medicine. And so scientific misinformation is particularly pernicious and threatening, and it contradicts the community's best available information. It can lead to misperceptions, which is a belief in misinformation. It can foster and sometimes become entangled with politics and partisan positions where divides exist, which we will call that politicized. It's become politicized when these divisions and when parties have taken sort of distinct positions on issues or matters of science. They don't on most, but sometimes some of these issues do. And then finally, the politicization of science, as I'll talk about later, as I've studied it, is a communication tactic that involves accentuating the inherent uncertainty of scientific finding to cast doubt on the idea of consensus exists in order to sort of pursue or promote a particular agenda. And I can also talk about conspiracy theories versus conspiracies as well. But, in all of these cases, providing people with facts and educating them about the science sometimes it can be an effective approach, but often education and scientific literacy training are not the solution to sort of solving polarization and generating consensus. I'm going to skip ahead. And so I want to start with an example of, the first example I talk about is like the issue of climate change. And how did climate science become politicized? How did we get to where we're at over the last several decades of these deep and growing actual, partisan divisions over even the basic science about human-caused climate change? And in 1988, there really wasn't much of a divide at all. People didn't know much about the issue. George H.W. Bush promised to fight, the greenhouse effect with the White House effect, and conservatives were about as likely as liberals, to be concerned about the greenhouse effect or global warming. And in work with Professor Shapiro, that was published in Environmental Communication, we kind of did a detailed review of how that changed over time and the role of the U.S. news media, the role of political elites, and even addressing, pathways to sort of overcome this polarization. And just to talk a little bit about that, just for briefly, when we didn't see much of a division in the early 90s, but this politicization, this effort by fossil fuel industry, right-wing media, and others to plant seeds of doubt, to cast doubt, and it's been well documented in books like Merchants of Doubt and others. But there was this polarization that began to take place, being funded by these groups in the mid 90s and throughout the 90s, then culminating to what we see in marked trends in sort of people's partisans' concern about climate change over time. When we look from 1997 to 2016, what's really remarkable about that is the increasing number of statements organizations like the IPCC and other scientific organizations came out with over time, emphasizing with greater certainty. And we see really, while these haven't changed a lot on average, it's because we're seeing divisions in the way that partisans responded to this information environment and in their echo chambers due to factors that I'll talk about in a little bit later in the talk. And so, why is it important? Why are we concerned about what people think about climate change or vaccines? The absence of understanding on climate change can lead to, opposition to public policies that would reduce emission, making personal decision, inattention to land use and building changes. There can be effects on the health consequences, for people who are interested in studying the impacts of climate change in particular geographic locations. And so it's important for us to understand, if we're going to address these effectively, how we can build greater consensus. So in thinking about, how have social scientists really studied the effectiveness of science communication? Most of the work has been internet-based survey work. Oftentimes, some of this is observational with large nationally representative samples in different locations, but I would say the majority is probably more randomized survey experimental-based treatments with populations that are diverse but represented and not representative or probability-based samples, where you randomly assign people to different, to a control group that doesn't get any information and measure their attitudes, and you provide people with other information, theoretically motivated, why that information should shift attitudes, why it might, to test the effects of those, the causal effect, at least in this setting, in sort of a one-shot or two-shot setting. How does just the exposure to different kinds of information influence people's responsiveness or their preferences or decisions? And so again, I've kind of said this already, but we need to know why people are rejecting this if we want to know what steps we can take to overcome resistance. And so, broadly with findings on climate change, but this is applicable to the other work that I'll talk about. A lot of what I've done in my own research builds on research from Chong and Druckmann and others, not just in political science, communication, social psychology, who have looked at the effects of different kinds of message frames, emphasis frames, emphasizing distinct but potentially relevant considerations that might influence people's attitudes. And there's a huge literature, at least in climate change communication, that has looked at sort of emphasizing the effects of emphasizing the level of scientific agreement or consensus that exists on human-caused climate change, and the impacts that has not only on their beliefs about the level of consensus, but also beliefs in this fundamental science itself and downstream effects on support for policy actions. There are certainly many, many other kinds of that's the gateway belief model, and has been, Van der Linden and some other folks, George Mason, Yale Climate Change Communication Lab have done a lot of work on that gateway belief model, this belief in that a consensus really exists. Other work has looked at local. I mean, there's so many different framing effects focus, but other things have looked at sort of proximity effects and the local effects of when those are emphasized relative to more distal impacts. And there are a variety of other sort of types of ways that people have studied how different messages might overcome resistance or shift attitudes. I'll talk a little bit more about some other kinds of framing studies that have looked at, warning people about scientific misinformation and how that can help combat attitude polarization or people's responsiveness to politicization, the politicization of scientific information. We also have had there are also a lot of studies out there to look at how prior beliefs, cultural worldviews, sources, partisanship, message credibility matters. And so there's really a big growing body of research that's, kind of happened on this over the last 20 years. So to kind of shift gears, I want to talk about, some research that I've done recently on COVID, the origins of COVID-19, and then also on how messages can affect people's willingness to get vaccinated. And so this is, actually a paper that published earlier this year with my colleague, Risa Palm, in Urban Studies at Georgia State and a graduate student, where we conducted a survey experiment that looked at how different kinds of messages affected 1,000 MTurk respondents. These are survey workers who you can recruit and pay and then randomly assigned to different conditions, where we had 6 different conditions. Oh, can't click on that. 6 different conditions in this study that highlighted the safety and efficacy of the vaccine or lack thereof, or manipulated descriptive social norms about whether most others were likely to take it or most others weren't likely to take it. And then also some messages that politicized the conditions where the message was politicized, suggesting that it was being either rushed for political motivations by the Trump administration, or whether it was being promoted to gain greater control over individuals' freedoms through mandates and things like that. And so, we looked at the effects of these, and this was right sort of in May 2020 when we fielded this. And, one of the takeaways from this was the finding that descriptive norm messages or emphasizing the safety could have a really powerful effect when people thought the vaccine was being rushed. It reduced people's propensity to say they would have, intentions to get vaccinated, increased vaccine resistance, vaccine hesitancy. So, it's just one of the studies where we show messages, different kinds of messages can shift attitudes. When we're talking about conspiracy theories, this is the same team that I worked with on that last paper. And this was published in Science Common 2020, but we exposed people to, different theories about the origins of the novel coronavirus, and particularly about whether it was zoonotic or human engineered, and looked at the effects of that on people's sort of willingness to support funding for biomedical research, willingness to punish China, beliefs about the actual origin of it, and then also how exposure to conspiracy theories can lead to, there's this literature that talks about how it reduces people's likelihood to engage in behaviors or make decisions that will benefit the collective good. We didn't know if it would, that's been shown in van der Linden's work on climate change. When people are exposed to climate conspiracy theories, they become demotivated and less likely to be willing to do or support policies or take actions that would mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. And so we actually, we included a research question on that because we weren't sure it would be analogous here, because even if people believe that it was engineered in a lab, there still could be reasons for them to engage in, getting vaccinated or social distancing in order to, just protect themselves. Whereas if they think climate change is a conspiracy or believe that, then they might really see no reason to engage in those behaviors. So van der Linden calls it a conspiracy theory effect. We actually found similar results, regardless of whether people were exposed to the conspiracy in isolation or in competition. It reduced Democrats, Republicans, and independents in the sample willingness to engage in social distancing and other types of behaviors that would reduce the spread of the virus. So, there's a lot of this out there that, when the science gets political, we just need to stick to the science. But what a lot of the work I want to talk about, what I want to talk about next is how, facts require interpretation. They're not encountered in isolation. Science can easily be politicized due to the inherent uncertainty of its conclusions. We don't prove hypotheses. And this can reduce its otherwise positive effect because it's easy for actors to cast doubt on that, or that we can really believe that. Individuals may value sources other than science for knowledge, and that may lead to directional motivations when they process information to reject information that's incongruent with their existing beliefs or their existing identities or worldviews. And, and one of the things that's troubling about this in the context of scientific misperceptions is it suggests that expertise or scientific expertise alone is not going to be sufficient for bolstering the effects of sort of factual information that might be used as, to correct these misperceptions. So to talk about, some of these effects of politicization that I've studied, and also, just to give a few examples, some of this work goes back to a lot of my earlier work with Jamie Druckman, Faye Cook at Northwestern University when I was a graduate student, and work that we did in subsequent years, but sort of defining this politicization as a rhetorical tactic and looking at how when you give people consensus information about nuclear power and about the positive benefits of it to generate electricity, what politicization can do to that. It can undermine otherwise credible and impactful consensus evidence. It can lead to status quo biases. This was one of our first efforts to sort of look at, the causal effects of different types of messages in settings where that, the arguments are politicized or, through framing. So when we think about, what can we do given the presence of misinformation, the presence of politicization, these deep divisions, the idea that people are motivated reasoners, that they seek out information that confirms their existing beliefs. They actively avoid information that challenges their existing beliefs. They find evidence and arguments that are consistent with their existing views as stronger when they evaluate those messages and they do messages that are dissonant. And these are sort of built into, the human architecture of decision making and judgment. And so, I'd say where we're at now is, and this is what can we do? How can we overcome, the challenges presented by misinformation, politicization, conspiracy theories in an era where, these have proliferated even more with the technological changes that we've seen. One thing when I talked about inoculations earlier, you may recognize this face, Senator Warnock, Raphael Warnock. They had a runoff election. Some of you might have seen some commercials on that. We see, I don't think the commercials ever ended here, but right after the presidential election, and we knew there was going to be a runoff, there were commercials that came out, and it was just Senator Warnock introducing himself with a puppy and saying, "Hey, you're going to hear a lot of bad things about me. I know most people didn't, not everyone knew a lot about Senator Warnock." And so these commercials for the first week or two were just with puppies, and I like puppies, and not much more. But trying to inoculate against what would be some of so it's an example to bring to life what inoculation is. I hope that's relevant, makes sense. But the idea here is when we inoculate against scientific misinformation, what we're trying to do is warn people or give them a weakened dose of misinformation that's then refuted, and that establishes an initial attitude that people then use when they later encounter politicized science arguments or misinformation, to kind of protect or inoculate against the negative effects that occur from that. What do we know about how effective that is? This is a communication theory. I found in some research with Jamie Druckman at Northwestern that goes back a little ways. We looked at ways to overcome politicization through warnings or through corrective messages, about emergent energy technologies in 2 different experiments through the use of, these warnings or these corrections where we motivated people to sort of strive for an accuracy motivation rather than for protecting their existing opinions. And when you're talking about scientific technologies that people don't know much about, these were carbon nanotubes in one of the studies, and people don't really know what carbon nanotubes are, hydraulic fracking in the other one. But we found that, we were able to both protect against the otherwise effects that we observed of politicization. And in fact, even the corrective information, when people were motivated to evaluate it accurately, overcame any resistance. And you might not be surprised, maybe that's not as hard because initial attitudes weren't as polarized on these low salient sort of technologies people don't know much about. So we replicated sort of, a very similar replication to that study that looked at partisanship and the politicization of consensus messages about climate change rather than carbon nanotubes and fracking. And what we found was that we had a much harder time protecting or guarding against, through inoculations or warnings, the effects that politicization produced, particularly on skeptical audiences. And so there was really these techniques in this study, and others have found different. This is really only a few studies have tried to do this experimentally, but there's some mixed findings so far, and we weren't as successful in this experiment as we were in the other. And so, again, I've already talked about this, but a lot of it can be due, especially like on that, when you see the differences in those 2 studies, the role that motivated reasoning can play, whether that's motivated reasoning to defend an existing belief or motivated reasoning based on interpreting information through the lens of our partisan worldviews and interpreting what evaluating the types of information we trust based on that information. And so, one way we can try to overcome this, I guess, was in another study published with my team here at Georgia State in 2019, looked at how visually animated maps of climate change, whether that's heat maps, and people didn't just look at the pictures. They looked at it in a moving slide animated. So you'd see flooding of Boston or flooding of Miami, or you'd see these heat waves that would occur. And we found that, I can talk about any of these studies, I'm going through a lot, but we saw that, when these types of compelling images were present alongside textual frames, it could have an effect, particularly among Republicans, at shifting their opinions toward the consensus and toward more concern. So, so there's a large literature on sort of visual framing effects and visually or emotionally compelling frames. And so that's one avenue that I've looked at in addition to inoculations. I'm not going to talk about that in more detail. I can come back to it if there's questions. Also, I've looked at the impact of message sources on the effectiveness of communications about climate change, where we hold constant the arguments or frames about the effects on the environment or the effects on national security, and then we attribute those arguments to Republican leaders, Democratic Party leaders, military officials, or climate scientists. And we found that, again, I can talk about any of these particular studies. You might have questions on in detail later, but we found that, not surprisingly, Republicans in our samples, in our experiments, were more likely to be moved by frames when they're endorsed by in-group partisan leaders compared to out-group partisan leaders or climate scientists in this case. Also, military officials were actually a pretty powerful source for all groups in our study when they were linked with arguments about climate change. Bottom line, credibility or perceived credibility of sources of delivering information matters a lot. In terms of, evolved information environments, I think just one big comment on this, we've seen this rise of bots, trolls, dark money, morally charged content, emotionally charged content, misinformation that's shared more easily. Gossip and outrageous content is less costly in these online settings. And so I haven't looked at this, but others, and talking about sort of the third part of this talk, what to do, have looked at possible strategies that involve institutional and financial roots, addressing the roots of that misinformation spread, coordinated multidisciplinary efforts to identify groups that finance, produce, and disseminate information or politicization as a way to confuse the public, other techno-cognitive strategies and architectures that suit the post-truth era that we live in. And again, there's all kinds of, the research that's being done on that. So just one, I saw not long ago in a Washington Post article, 10 out of the 638 segments, this was on 111 users contributing to half of all misinformation, vaccine hesitancy content on, and I didn't write, I think it's either Facebook. Yes, it was Facebook. Thank you. It was a Facebook internal study posted about in the Washington Post. Really interesting about how some of those articles get on Facebook and how much engagement they actually get. It's important to understand how to overcome these obstacles in this environment, especially with new technologies that we combat climate change. In the last two slides that I have, we just mentioned a couple studies that I'm working on or that are forthcoming or under review. Just two. One, this is forthcoming with my team at Georgia State on looking at how conspiracy rhetoric can influence views about the consequences of climate change. And this is from the Fourth National Climate Assessment Report. And we also look at that sort of in isolation about the effects that are going to occur in the US and also in competition with conspiracy rhetoric, where we vary sources, partisan sources associated that in 3,000. There's two different social experiments in this study. The first one was on the effects of climate change on the US from the Fourth Assessment Report, with conspiracy rhetoric from former President Trump that was actually real. We didn't have to make it up. We just used it from the response that he had to when it was released over the Thanksgiving holiday in that year. And then the second, it was a 3,000 person 7-condition experiment. And the second one was a parallel study looking at sort of left-wing conspiracy rhetoric towards direct carbon capture methods to, direct air capture, I guess, is a way to, a climate engineering solution, and what happened when people know much less about that. And I'm happy to talk about the details of that study if you have questions. But the bottom line was we found the bottom line was that there was a very conditional conspiracy rhetoric effect, whereas conspiracy rhetoric had little effects when it came from President Trump or when it was attacking this report about the effects of climate change on the US. However, it had a big effect in our second study of 3,000 different individuals that was parallel in design when we were dealing with a topic that people knew little about, when it was conspiracy rhetoric about support for technologies related to direct air capture, carbon capture. And this is a final study. This is actually not published. It's under review right now, but it's something that I'm actively engaged in on a new project as well, that's related to studying support for solar geoengineering research and how frames encountered in different contexts that support the science or contexts that politicize the science, can influence how people evaluate or form opinions about this emerging technology that's increasingly being discussed, at least research-wise, on methods that might be useful, such as strategic aerosol injections or putting mirrors in space or other things. So happy to talk about that paper as well if you have any questions. And so in conclusion, great, right at 30. This transformation of the communication environment is a defining feature of the 21st century. The emergence of media choice, cable news, social media, means we live in a fragmented and polarized media environment. This has a lot of positive consequences, such as easier access to information and worldwide connectivity, but it also introduces challenges such as echo chambers, where people can evade information that's contrary to their standing beliefs. There is this really troubling consequence of the increased likelihood of being exposed to misinformation or fake news, given there are less trusted gatekeepers to curate information for accuracy, and anyone can sort of claim to be experts while disseminating falsehoods. So, science exists to provide systematic knowledge to improve decision making, but in this changed media environment, it has sort of undermined the privileged cultural authority of science to allow anyone to be seen, claim to be scientific. And so it's important for us to determine ways that we can overcome this, both to help individuals and society. So thank you very much for your time, and I will escape out of this and try to stop sharing my screen. Let's see.
Great. Thank you. That was excellent. We're going to take some questions now. Daniel Bliss.
Yeah. So I popped up a couple of questions there in the chat, but the really big one there is this question of fatalism with regard to science. It seems to me, just observing people on the ground and hearing chatter about it in the press, that we're at a bit of an inflection point with the climate change debate, with skeptics coming around to the idea that it is real, but emphatically rejecting the idea that we can or should do anything about it. How central are you finding that this is this actually being actively used in framing strategies from conservative and far-right media?
That's a great question. Thank you, Daniel. I would love to hear others jump in too, because they probably, I haven't really seen this fatalism frame, but I also haven't been looking in some of these media circles as much as maybe even Matt or others who might kind of be more attuned. I'm not on a lot of social media, and I'm not on any actually. So I don't expose myself to some of those websites where some of these frames might be more prevalent. I don't know that I've, this frame, this idea that it's real, but we emphatically shouldn't do anything about it. I guess it does remind me a little bit of, well, I'm sorry if this is a little off track, first of all, and I don't know, but this idea of solution aversion as a motivation. When I think about Campbell and Kay's work in social psychology, they published an article in 2014 that kind of, and I wish I could remember the details of what they manipulated, but they showed very convincingly that it wasn't actually that conservatives or Republicans don't believe the science. It's that they're averse to the solutions that would follow if they, say that, yes, this is human caused and it's the problem. We're the cause of it. So I don't know if that gets at the question, and I don't know that it gets directly at whether fatalism with regard to the science is becoming a more prominent frame, but I think it's a good question. It's certainly possible.
Well, it means they're in a position where they can exploit the message, I would think, from what you just said.
Yeah.
Look,
the other thing, and I think that it sort of dovetails, is this question of in-group versus out-group messaging. If you have, if we have the siloed environment that we have, how do we penetrate it?
Now, that's a really excellent point. And I mean, honestly, I think that's where everyone's at, right? You know, I think a lot of this work's at right now is where do we go from here, and how do, you know, because even these few studies that I talked about with where do we go from here, they're no miracle cure. Even the gateway belief folks would say there is no magic bullet here. And so, you know, I do think finding ways to try to overcome those in-group, out-group dynamics is a real challenge.
Let me just add to that answer. I think you mentioned a couple of good ones, Toby, with regard to the having a key member of an in-group, you know, whether it's a member of the clergy or something like that. Isn't that aligned with some of the stuff, cultural cognition, where you have someone who's, you know, in that group that manages to communicate? So as long as the message is coming from inside, if you're in a rural community and one of the farmers in that community decides that they're going to suddenly believe that action needs to be taken on climate change, that would be much more persuasive than me coming from the outside saying, listen, farmers, this is what you need to do. So the messages are the source of the messages is really important. I wanted to answer your first question, Daniel, about fatalism. I don't know if this is exactly fatalism, but the way you framed the question reminded me of how Bjorn Lomborg always has spoken about the issue of climate change. At first, he was like, it's not real, but now he says, oh, it is real, but the costs are too expensive to do anything about it. So he's sort of shifting in a way that is very much representative of that conservative far right group.
That kind of reminds me of this book that you've probably all seen already. I think that it gets into Michael Mann's the new climate war, and I think that argument resonates with the argument in this book quite well.
Because it's something that I've seen with COVID. I heard from a lot of people. I know quite a lot of Trump supporters, and it's something that I hear quite a bit.
Yeah. And I think also, to build off what Matt said as well, like I don't know how familiar, if any of you heard of Dan Kahan's work, but he's a psychologist at Yale, does some excellent stuff. Just really amazing work on cultural cognition theory. And one of my favorite papers, and I'm going to forget the specific details, but it was like 2011 or so, where they varied pictures of scientists, and they varied whether the scientist was advocating a scientific position that was congruent or incongruent with right or left wing positions on sort of like gun control. I want to say like gun control was one of them, maybe climate change was another, and then maybe like nuclear power. I don't remember the third one, but what was really fascinating about that was the degree of expertise that was attributed to the scientists, depending on whether or not the scientists were actually taking positions that were. So in that sense, you know, even perceptions of the messenger, especially when you're dealing with scientific issues that have become politicized, or conspiracy theories where scientists are sort of at the root of it. Well, anyway, I just think it's interesting because it goes to show how motivations on issues that have become already politicized can color people's interpretations, even of which scientists possess expertise, you know, who they even trust. So anyhow, thanks Matt for that, because I think it fit.
So I have a couple questions, if you don't mind, Matt. I'll jump in. So one of the interesting problems that I find with all of this is what I like to call the arbitration of truth. Who do you turn to when both sides are willing to just make up whatever they want to get their point across? I mean, take, for example, everything you mentioned with Trump and climate change, but then you had Justice Sotomayor with 100,000 kids are hospitalized with COVID a week or so ago. And so my problem is this politicization of science, I think, is really dangerous because you can't turn to somebody who's, for lack of better words, just not willing to make stuff up.
I think that's a really great point. Who's supposed to be these arbitrators of truth, and we have sort of seen debates over that a little bit, excuse me, with respect to these, fact-checking sites and things along those lines, and then, real disagreements over who gets to be the arbitrators of truth. And I think maybe some of that comes back to this idea, I wonder if some of it comes back to this idea that, facts never speak for themselves, but that, and require interpretation, but also reminds me of that, I think that's only true to an extent because, science exists to generate facts and knowledge. And so I was reading this other book I've got laying here somewhere on the war on science. And if you haven't read that book by Otto, it's a fantastic book about how facts became the subject of sort of such debate in specific instances. And so I don't think I have an answer to your question. I'm struggling, Jeff. I think it's a great question. I wish I had an answer to what do we do? What do we do? How do we find arbitrators of truth? But I would ask for audience help on this question. I need to have some others jump in. Matt?
I'm gonna take it back. I'm not co-piloting this. There are a lot of smart people in the audience here that have ideas about what to do if we have some misinformation coming from one side and the other simultaneously. How do we deal with that?
Oh, that's another problem all in its entirety. I mean, when
I heard
both
you
sides
asking.
are lying about the same problem, then you got a huge nightmare.
Right. I didn't mean exactly that, but yeah, not perfect messages.
Yeah.
And anyone, if no one wants to chip in, we can come back to this, and Jeff can be frustrated with no.
All good. Yeah. So my next question is kind of arbitrators of truth, and you just held up a climate change book, and so we'll take Michael Mann, for example. Mm-hmm. Michael Mann is a climate scientist, and he has done an incredible job. For those of you who don't know, Michael Mann came up with the hockey stick plot in climate change that basically shows the temperature. Has done a great job of describing what happens with climate change. What about his expertise, though, gives him the ability to suggest what the solution should be?
I think that's a great question. And it really gets at this idea that as scientists, what is our role in advocacy, right? I mean, I think I don't know that's directly the question, but I think there's a point here. It reminds me certainly of Pelkey's work on The Honest Broker. And when we talk about scientists who engage in sort of, here's the science of what's happening and having people trust that, what happens when scientists take off that scientist hat and put on an advocacy cap or begin to advocate for particular solutions where people with different values might disagree about, the priorities that various solutions could have. And so I think that in these situations, what Pelkey and others would recommend is not that, there's disagreement on this, honestly, in some of the literature about what the best role is for science. I mean, I know probably some of you haven't heard of, this Matt Mata has done some work on the March for Science and how this March for Science actually led to polarization, or polarized or negative attitudes towards scientists as they become seen as more of a political group or a group that's advocating for more research funds or advocating for particular policy solutions. So I think all of that research, I hope, somewhat speaks to the topic that you're raising in this second question. But this idea of how can we and what should Michael Mann's role be? And I would just say that, we probably all have opinions on this. What Pelkey says, I guess I find pretty persuasive. I find Roger Pelkey persuasive on this, is saying that if scientists are going to be very active in advocacy, they need to be super transparent and clear that they're stepping out of their role as an expert speaking about the science of the physical system or whatever they're an expert on, and stepping into the role of talking about, advocating for particular solutions. And so, there's threats with that. Did that speak at all to the question you were getting at, Jeff?
I don't know. Maybe I'm probably couching it a little too broadly. But so, for example, my problem is climate change scientists are expert in heating of the atmosphere, amount of CO2. So my problem is when they start straying away and offering suggestions to how to remake the energy supply system. They're not experts in that.
Yeah.
And so it's one thing to say, okay, well, I'm the one who identified climate change, so everybody needs to stop burning fossil fuels.
Yeah.
That is somewhat of a stretch, because there are significant negative consequences to the immediate stoppage of burning fossil fuels.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you would say that's,
I think this leads back a little bit to Daniel's question too, in that the messaging. So, for example, I think most people are coming around to climate change is actually occurring, and I think that's a good thing. However, there are significant negative consequences to doing some of the solutions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's more what people object to, replacing all fossil fuels tomorrow, banning fossil fuels tomorrow without anything in place to replace it, could cause a lot more short-term harm than climate change.
Right.
And I think that's something that has to be weighed. And I don't know a lot of people who are working on that specific area. And it would be interesting to see.
No, I think that's something that we haven't seen a lot of people move beyond, but because some of this, what I showed you with all these communication studies, a lot of this is only really started with experimental work anyway within the last 15 to 20 years. So it's in political science even later than that. But I think that, Pelkey would agree, I think, a lot with what you're saying about how, because scientists themselves, of course, can politicize science, and those, when they're stepping into those roles, they can be contributing to it. They can contribute to the politicization of science. And Pelkey says that directly and has a chapter, I think, in his book, Honest Broker, on how scientists can politicize science and what the negative effects that can have. So I agree with you on that as well.
There is a question in the chat that I'll get to in a minute. What I wanted to bring up was something that I've actually talked about in class with some of my students that isn't very unlike this situation that you guys are discussing. In the last, 2 weeks, we've seen the FDA revise a lot of their COVID-related protocols, from 10 days to 5 days. Shifting, of course, saying that more people need to get boosted, and that now we can get away with wearing masks, but we shouldn't wear cloth masks because Omicron. I don't know why Omicron's any different, but maybe because of its contagion level. Omicron, especially cloth masks, are a bad idea. So I'm not sure if you guys are aware of this, but this is not based on science in the formal sense of science, that it's gone through some sort of vetted process of review. And yet these are the new mandates from the FDA. So we see what is essentially a policy that's not founded on science in the formal sense of science. And yet there's an urgency to it. The results will come out. And they've made that perfectly clear that, we're making this new policy based on what we expect will happen, but it's not only science, and we need to take into consideration people going back to school, businesses opening, etc. What do you I guess think about that, Toby? Is this going to be more potentially politicizing going forward? I guess that's my question.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that I didn't talk about a chapter that I worked on really most recently, which was on politicization, and COVID, and just a review of this. But I think you're absolutely, you're absolutely right. Could you just say what was the specific question though that you addressed?
Oh, I'm just saying, are we in for the Biden administration, right? Are they creating a future problem for themselves by not sticking with the science-based method and instead having a variant?
What will humans tolerate, and what will actually work, and divorce from what the best practices are. Yeah, I think that's certainly an issue, especially because you see, we'll see a lot of the messaging has been muddled since the beginning, right? With and that inconsistent and muddled messaging from these, the administrations that have been involved and the spokespersons for those. I think they've probably contributed massively. All I can think of is, like how the right-wing folks that I know, or my parents or my family, my dad anyway, will ask, me about how much I trust these recommendations from these doctors, Dr. Fauci and others, and he just doesn't know. And it's like, wow, man, he's living in this universe where someone's been really, in this situation where there's changing messaging, and I think it's led to declining trust in these institutions, but also those institutions themselves and the folks in them have contributed to that, So I guess I would say yes. I think it's a problem, and I think there's an effort to try to balance, the science, the best available science and what can be done ideally and what should be done ideally with pragmatic questions about where to go and how things are going to play out politically. And I think that's we've all witnessed that, and I think it's probably certainly part of it's part of the issue that I thought about that chapter I mentioned. That's something that we write about in a section in that chapter, is the role of the CDC and administration messaging over time. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
So speaking of your father, Eric Johnson says people who are more likely to trust a source from the inside than the outside. How do you persuade someone enough to become that inside source? How is there any strategy to do that?
I would strongly recommend checking out Andrew Hoffman's book. Hoffman wrote a book on culture and the climate wars. I didn't get the title exactly right, but if you look up Andrew Hoffman at Stanford, there's a book on culture, Bridging This Divide. I wish I had all my notes present when I talked about that book several years ago, but I remember several kind of takeaways. And, how do you become inside, and how do you kind of bridge that divide? I think, there's several things here. Hoffman would say a lot of times, and I've learned this in my own interpersonal conversations about climate change, is how you say something or how you approach people with something is sometimes more important than what you're saying. And that's probably especially true in families, right? It's easier to get frustrated and say things in ways that they're not listening, they're not hearing. And so, think about delivering, I suppose that you're building trust isn't something you do like that or snap your fingers or anything, but at least with the folks that are your neighbors or your family or people that you do interact with, I think, affirming their worldviews can help. There's some social psychology here, in terms of building interpersonal trust, affirming people's worldviews, affirming their moral, some of this stuff's become so hyper moralized that affirming that, look, these people that have these worldviews there are some conspiracies are real. So not everybody who believes the conspiracy is wrong all the time, but this one's not. And, I didn't talk about that study, but we did a study that looked at how people who believe climate change was a conspiracy theory responded to consensus information. And this was several years ago. This was struck me. We found we affirmed people's general worldviews that conspiracies exist, but then told them like, this is not in this case, this isn't one. They were more moved relative to those who didn't have the affirmation than the folks whose values were affirmed. So take from that you will, but it's one small, tiny experimental study. But I think there is something that we can learn from it about how to be more persuasive. I think finding, Hoffman talks in that book about finding common solutions. CCL is an interest group that I have given a talk to that's interested in sort of carbon fee and dividend proposal and sort of building conservative support for market-based solutions, finding ways to not talk about the polarizing aspect. Hey, is climate change happening? Is it happening? Is it happening? Admit it. You're wrong. You guys are wrong. You've been wrong for 20 years. Get away from that and get to like, what are some areas where we could agree on some solutions to this problem we all really know is happening. I can't go through all of the recommendations that Hoffman has. Those are the ones that stick out in my mind. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
That's great.
I hope it gets to it a little bit.
Yeah, that's great. Jonathan has a question.
Yeah, hi, Toby. Thanks for a great presentation. Really interesting. And just a caveat, I come at this from a more political economy sort of perspective. And so I'm wondering how much of what you find you would associate or could associate with neoliberalism, in particular, so the denigration of institutions, of centralized political authority in favor of the glorification of free markets, not just for goods and services in this case, but for ideas and beliefs and information.
Gosh, that's a good question, and I'm trying to search. So I may I'm thinking about that for a minute. How much of this is due to the glorification of free markets and undermining of institutions. Gets to some pretty big questions about. This is stuff that my colleague Jennifer McCoy is working on, and others, right now. But like undermining of democratic norms and undermining of our democratic institutions and trust in our institutions, and so I think you're right. I think there's something there. I am embarrassingly not really well versed in those. Those are some big questions that I haven't studied in particular, but I certainly think that this declining trust in institution and declining norms of civility are probably, I very much believe they are a contributor to this polarization that we're seeing and these pernicious effects of it being, motivated reasoning and divides over science-based issues. And I'm sure that's not a satisfactory answer to a very great
start.
question, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. I don't know that were your reaction if I didn't adequately answer it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great start at an answer, and I guess my question is based on somewhat informed speculation about this. As I often tell my students in political science classes, especially aimed at the STEM students who take them, in politics, belief and perception are more important than fact, until fact comes back and bites you, and maybe even not then. And I think what you're looking at a lot in your work is the maybe even not then situation.
Yeah. Thank you. I think you're right.
Any other questions? Someone wants to ask one, but isn't. Anyone else? Well, let me ask one then, Toby, to shift gears. You presented a lot of really interesting work that you've done, a lot of interesting experiments. What's, the cutting edge of those methods these days? Where are you thinking that the field needs to go to improve some of these social experiments?
That's a great question. I mean, the field in general, I think there's a strong argument. Dan Kahan has made this most forcefully, and I totally agree with it, is that we have this massive amount of laboratory or survey experimental studies. And what we need to do is test interventions in the field. Now, there's a reason there aren't so many of those, really well-designed field experiments. There are some. I like some of the work of like Alcott and others who have looked at interventions partnered up with energy companies where they include emoticons on the energy bills and actually affect people's behavior in a positive way. So, and that's an easy one to pick out, where the basic research on norm-based influence can have a direct effect on applied work and human behavior in a setting. So I think that that's one example, and maybe some of you've even seen it and seen a lot of this work because it's so awesome and it's so rare, and you're partnering with like energy companies and things like that. I don't think all the work has to do that, but I think when possible, when we can take some of our interventions into the real world to see how to really overcome it, I think that would be important to do. Although the caveats are these are extremely expensive, obviously, really hard to pull off. You've got to have a lot of times partnerships with others. And so, but I think that's a great place for the field to go in terms of looking at ways to study behavior in other settings, and still leverage the causal inference and power of an experiment to demonstrate that convincingly. I don't know if that adequately answers it. It's kind of a short answer. There's other stuff, but I think the easiest one would be do more, have more field experiments.
Great. We have a couple minutes. Jeff, did you have another question? I saw you unmuted. Oh, no, you didn't. I'm sorry. I'm looking at the wrong place for the mic. Hal, last question to you.
I think you're muted, maybe.
Thanks for great talk, Toby. So just wondering, for this kind of misinformation, how did you see, like, for different group of people or for different topic, then have different strategies?
Great question. And please, my understanding is, how do different groups or people respond? How do we find that? One of the things that was somewhat surprising, because it's been different, of course, across some of the studies. I think one of the surprising things, I'll start with climate change. You find in a lot of these survey experiments and research on climate change that Democrats and the control conditions are already like all the way at the end point. They have how concerned are they about climate change? How worried are they? Do they believe in it? And you have almost everyone in these surveys who identifies as a Democrat on board. So what happens is when you treat those individuals with information and try to detect differences in like Democrats and the control and treatment, you're not finding it. Subpopulations on a lot of our recent studies, we've seen most of our movement. I think I can't confidently say about all the literature, but I think a lot of survey experimental work on climate messages now are showing more movement, oftentimes among Republican response, depending on the design. But just, that's one thing to say. It's because of, again, these ceiling effects on Democrat respondents being already so high. In terms of vaccines, framing on the origins of COVID, vaccine hesitancy, one of the things that I was surprised about and have been surprised about, not only in the study that I talked about, but in two other studies that I've seen that have looked at these generalized effects of messages on vaccine hesitancy, is a general lack of heterogeneity across subgroups in terms of their responses to the treatments. And so what we're seeing is that the messages are having kind of universal effects in the ways that we would think across each of these groups. So, there's still a lot more to be done on that. And I think one of the big issues with a lot of the work that I do in parsing out individual subgroup differences or individual level differences is I've had to deal with samples that don't really provide great inferences about. They're not representative samples of Republicans per se. They're MTurk workers on MTurk workers who identify as Republicans who are 70% under the age of like 45 or something. So younger, just different in different ways. And so I'm hesitant to say a lot of these things that I've found in my own work generalize to what would be more appropriate nationally representative samples to look at interaction effects with subpopulations. But again, that's a really gross generalization on just a few of the studies that I presented today, because there certainly are many studies that have also detected, heterogeneous treatment effects. There are many studies that have detected backfire effects where people respond in the opposite direction of a message. I didn't have time to talk about that today, but I've got a paper that came out in Weather, Climate, and Society called Don't Tell Me What to Do. And it was about what happens when you tell people that they need to eat less meat and take less showers and have all these personal sacrifices or support these policies. And guess what happens to Republicans and independents who are told they probably should stop eating meat, take shorter showers, and things like that. Relative to Republicans who aren't told that, they move in the opposite direction. So they reject the communication due to some stuff that we argue might have to do with psychological reactance when our there's these feelings that our freedoms are being limited or constricted in any way. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I hope that was what you were asking about subgroups and misinformation. And I think it probably varies a lot depending on the particular topic and depending on what kind of information that you are treating people with.
So then for this generalization, all the methods actually applying to other topics as well?
Help me with that. I'm not sure I understand the
question. I mean, just now you said the generalization and all these methods,
right.
They are also applying to other topics, or the topics doesn't matter?
Yeah. Oh, no, I think that, the topic can matter. Like I said, if I understand what you're asking correctly, I think the topic matters a lot because it can depend. Just in these particular studies that I talked about today, where we looked at differences in partisans, we didn't find that the messages were they didn't depend upon the partisanship of our sample. If they worked for one group, they tended to work for other groups. But that, again, it depends upon the particular attitude or opinion or decision you're dealing with, right? Because when it was telling people that they need to take these actions, it was really only independents and Republicans who negatively reacted and not Democrats. So I think in terms of bigger questions about generalization of this work with external validity, I think that, all studies have questions about external validity. And so what we need is each of these studies is sort of best seen as one, and then once we have 20 or so of them showing the same things, or we get meta-analyses, we can know a lot more about effect sizes and also about how subpopulations respond, or at least in ways that I would be confident. I'm much more confident in saying, hey, these messages work in this way on average than I am in some of my own work with smaller samples and less diverse samples or representative samples that are hinging my predictions on how different groups are going to respond differently to a particular treatment. So I still don't feel adequate about how I answered your question, but
no, you answered very well. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, great. On that note, we are a few minutes over, so I want to end now, let people go to class if they have it, but especially I want to thank you, Toby, and I forget how we do it. People write applause in the chat, or you do this, but we're very grateful for you showing up. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thanks for your discussion and great questions.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Honestly, thanks is to you for taking your time out of your day to listen to this, and I hope you found it interesting. And just really appreciate you all being here today and your great questions. So thank you all very much.
Thanks. That's it.
Thanks. Great talk.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, no, it's very nice and very difficult subjects, unfortunately, because